Welcome back, guys, to another Thursday Deep Dive. I'm here with Josh, and Josh and I, when we were talking about the prosperity gospels. One of you guys had asked, hey, what's up with the prosperity gospel, and maybe why is it not so good? And so I brought it up to Josh as something that we could talk about. And when we started to kick the tires on that sort of potential deep dive, Josh kept telling me at the end he wanted to do a study on Job. And so this is the fundamentally allowing Josh to be Josh and to just get the thing that he wanted. So there's a reason, and he always had that reason. And so why don't we start with just kind of the Job synopsis. Who, when, how is it written?
Okay, so we have no idea who wrote the book of Job.
Okay, yes.
And furthermore, we have no idea when it was written.
Okay.
So there's a lot of patriarchal setting in terms of elements in the story. Mm-hmm. The fact that his riches were counted in cattle, not in like gold or anything like that.
Yeah.
And so the historical setting looks a bit older than the language, but the language looks like maybe middle Israelite history, like in the kingdom, maybe. I mean, but the language itself is very unique, and there's a lot of words that we only find in Job, in the ancient Hebrew. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to when this book was written and who wrote this book. Mm-hmm. And what's more is that there's a lot of debate over whether the events in Job are describing a historical event or if it's describing a story.
Yeah.
And a lot of people feel like for God to present this to us, if God is presenting this to us, it must be true. Mm-hmm. And for it to be true, it means it has to have actually happened exactly the way it says. Mm-hmm. But the way that Job is referenced elsewhere in the Bible, like in Ezekiel, it's like, hey, look at these wise men, or these righteous men, Noah, Job, and then either Daniel or this Canaanite figure who was righteous. There's some ambiguity that we don't need to go into.
Okay.
But commonly it's said Daniel.
Be a side note to that? Okay.
That'd be a whole separate, but we're not doing a deep dive on one or two verses in the middle of Ezekiel.
Okay.
These are some really righteous people.
Yeah.
That, for this example. And then like in James, it's like, hey, look at Job as an example of patience while suffering or whatever. And so there's this trend that for this to be, if this is from God, then it's true. And if it's true, that means it's historically happened. But God has taught us with stories, at other points in the Bible.
Yeah. I mean, we see that oftentimes with like when Jesus will tell a story and not necessarily, he's not launching into, I'm telling everybody a parable here. This didn't really actually happen. And I'm trying to, denote some sort of truth for you. And so the question about like, say, his parable about Lazarus, right? And he goes to hell and he's just one sip of water. If he could go back and tell everybody, and that's the question still is the same of like, that's a parable, right? Like that's Jesus is telling a story to obtain a truth for us to understand. And so it is important for us to kind of get whether it is a kind of a parable per se, or it is physically a thing that happened. Either way, God had a story to tell, and that ended up being in the Bible just the way that he wanted it to go. And so as we may have those questions, and the answers we probably won't have until we get to heaven, like we're going to look at this regardless as truth. And so that kind of gets to be a weird kind of thought process, but
there is a very distinct, direct truth God is teaching us in this book, and that distinct, direct truth is the purpose of the book is not to tell us, hey, here's the name of an old dude, yes. Right? The purpose of this book is to be like, here are these divine truths about how I run the world, mm-hmm. right? And so we have Job as God wanted us to have it.
Yep.
And it's a story God wanted us to have. And so a lot of these questions about is it historical, it's not that they're unimportant, it's just when we dive into the meaning of the book, we stop getting seeing their relevance when we're really digging in.
And I mean, this book has been in the Israelite canon.
Yeah.
Right? So it is important to denote or to make some sort of understanding of even though there might be some questions as to who or when it was written, at no real point were they having these huge major should we or should we not have this. This was kind of an accepted book in the Jewish tradition of the kind of the Old Testament, that they believed and we believe the same thing, that this is from God, it is of God, it's God's words, it's God inspired to write it. And so even though you might hear there's some hemming and hawing about whether it really happened or if it was a parable, the answer is at no point was there any question of whether or not it deserved to be with the other books of the Bible.
And that's a good point, because Job is not an Israelite. And so a book that the Israelites are like, hey, this is from God. Mm-hmm. And it's saying, hey, here's the story of this super righteous non-Israelite. It would seem like, based on our understandings of the culture, that there would be this sort of clash there of do we want to pencil in maybe he was an Israelite? But no,
Yeah,
they don't.
no.
And that is just a further testament to sort of the historical acceptance of this as from God.
All right. So if we've kind of outlined Job and that sort of stuff, and we pronounce it correctly as Job and not Job, why don't you just kind of set the stage? Why don't you give us the first two kind of chapters of Job, kind of the premise of the book and what's happening?
So Job is a very righteous man. It's not assumed. God himself says this man is righteous. And so
you got to know you're righteous when God says you're righteous. So, okay.
But he's also a very wealthy man. He's been blessed monetarily to a very large degree.
Right, and you were stating that this isn't in cash money; it's in old time currency, which was cattle,
livestock,
goats and sheep and
camels, oxen, everything.
Think about that.
Donkeys.
I'm the richest dude around. I got so many animals.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
At one point, God is sort of holding the council in heaven, and this person walks into this council, this spiritual being, and he's the adversary or the one opposed.
And so typically, I would say in kind of Christian tradition, we often point at this guy and say, clearly Satan.
Well, and the Hebrew is actually the Satan, the Satan.
See, it makes sense.
Yeah, but there's the there
Yep.
because it's that word in our tradition is a very specific individual. Mm-hmm. And whereas the word itself was used broader for an adversary or someone opposed, such that an angel of God would be one opposed to, I think it's Balaam, I think. It references the angel being opposed to him, being a Satan to him. And that's not to say that one sent from God is evil. It's opposed, it's an adversary, or it's whatever.
It's just a word.
Right.
And so it doesn't necessarily mean that. It clearly could fit the mold of Satan. I mean, this is something that Satan does. He's an adversary to us. This is why I think you were talking about early church kind of looked at this and said, easily, case in point here, you have an adversary. They're probably connecting the dots with the Hebrew words and being like, this would make a lot of sense to fulfill that role of the devil or this fallen angel, in which is a direct adversary to God. But in this particular context, it's really this idea of adversary to maybe a particular idea.
Yeah, it's unsure if it's to an idea or to Job, but it doesn't. The way that he interacts, it doesn't necessitate being opposed to God. Mm-hmm. But then that leaves, okay, so what is the potential idea? And so God's like, hey, what have you been doing? He's like, well, I've been traveling around the earth. And God's like, Have you met Job? Job is awesome. Job is righteous and all of this. But then the adversary asks, does Job love you? Does Job follow you for the right reasons? He's like, does Job fear you for no reason? Or you're protecting him, you're blessing him.
Yeah.
He's getting all of these benefits out of following you. Is he following? It raises the question of is it appropriate for God to reward righteous people with physical blessings? Because the question that's raised is, are they coming for God? Are they coming for the blessings?
Right.
And that's sort of the intro of how this all ties back to the prosperity gospel is what is the right way that God interacts with the world.
Why don't you kind of define? So you're kind of talking around kind of this issue, but this word usage that we're going to kind of talk about. Why don't you kind of really give framework to divine retribution? Because we were talking about it earlier, and I was telling him earlier that when I hear retribution, I think bad things. I think God, sending fire on bad people, not necessarily this idea that I think is being proposed here in Job 1 and 2.
Yeah. So divine retribution, like back, tribute, payment. It's just retribution just means paying back, but we get it in sort of the term like payback. Right?
Yes.
Like if I borrowed $15 from you, and then later I only had a 20, I was like, you know what? You just keep it all, right? That would be retribution, right? Because I was giving you what you were owed. Like, and so divine retribution is not exclusively in any way about punishment. It's about good people will be blessed by God. Evil people will be cursed by God.
Yeah.
It is very much you get what you're owed. Good people are owed good things. Bad people are owed bad things.
Okay. And so, right, like we get into this Job, and the main idea here is this adversary, he proposes, right, that, hey, the reason that he loves you is because you have been divinely, retributing to him. You've been giving him back all the good things because he's been good to you. So the question is that right? Is that an acceptable practice?
Yeah, and so here is actually where the theme of the book comes into play. A lot of times we look at Job and we're like, Job is a book about suffering. And Job is a book that is immensely filled with suffering. But Job itself isn't about suffering. It's about by what rule, how does God govern the world?
Right.
By what standard metric does God govern the world? And particularly, an assumption was God governs it by good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. And even if, like the evil person, even if I'm not able to punish them for what they deserve, God will. And even if I'm not even to pay that good person what they deserve, God will. Because good things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people.
Yes. And so at the end of 2, right, we have this kind of adversary say that, and then God makes a decision.
Yeah,
right?
God's like, go for it. Like, you can do this, but Job is legitimately righteous.
Yep.
And so Job's cattle, all of them, through different ways. And the story plays out where it's like one messenger comes up and he's like, hey, like, all your goats are dead or whatever.
Yeah.
And then as he's talking, another messenger comes up. He's like, hey, these raiders came and they took all your camels. And with all of them, it's like, and I'm the only one who survived to tell you. Like, all your camels and servants, were killed or taken away.
Yep.
And another one comes up. He's like, hey, all your oxen, and I'm the only one who survived to tell you. And then someone comes up. He's like, hey, a wind came and blew over your son's house while all your kids were having a party in it. And I'm the only one who survived to tell you. So it's not even staggered. It's like just a train of messengers who are like, excuse me, sir, once he's done telling you that bad thing, I have more for you.
I got another one.
Right. And so Job just loses everything
Everything.
at once.
But it is kind of interesting. It is important to note that God does say one thing in reference to, he says, you can take anything from him, all of the blessings I've given him, you just can't touch his life.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the only thing you can't touch. Okay, and so he does send that kind of like a little bit of, to protect the idea of Job and that, of like.
And so Job, when all of this happens, he is mourning immensely, but he still praises God.
Yep.
So then the adversary later is like, people would pay everything for their life. If someone came up to you and was like, either you give me everything you own or you die, they'll be like, well, if you do have the power to enforce that, take everything I own. Because I can, still live, still work to get new stuff. That's not necessarily the point of life or whatever.
Right.
And so because I have not been allowed, the experiment isn't totally proven yet, because I have not allowed to influence that which is most important to Job, which is Job himself.
Yes.
And so God allows him to then bring direct suffering on Job in just sores, boils, just immense physical pain, suffering. And Job's wife, who was allowed to live, is like, just curse God and die.
Yeah, just do it.
Like, this is no way to live. And
it all kind of sims back. And so we'll end up talking, kind of when he's at this point, he has these three really close friends, and they come and they talk to him. This is a story like, I've lived in the church long enough. I've heard this story a fair number of times. And I always think about it, these friends get this rap. It's kind of hard. I want to call them bad friends, and it's because they have this idea of divine retribution. And so why don't you kind of explain kind of what the friends end up rolling up and doing? And so maybe, do they deserve that bad of a rap? Are they that really bad of friends?
So the first, when they walk up, they don't even recognize Job initially because of how just wrecked Job is.
Yes.
And then they spend a week just, being with him, just waiting for like him to be in a place where like they feel comfortable talking and trying to work this out. Mm-hmm. And then after a week, they really start trying to figure out what this happened and how, and there's going to be three ideas here. We're going to have over here, we're going to have Job is righteous. Mm-hmm. And over here, we're going to have God is righteous. In the middle, we're going to have divine retribution, which is being how God interacts with the world. Mm-hmm. God blesses good people. God curses bad people.
Yep.
And so Job's friends walk up, and they want Job to be blessed. They care a lot about Job. And they start out, saying, hey, like, you've done a lot of good things. Mm-hmm. Like, they're not coming in guns blazing initially or whatever.
Yep.
And so, but they look at this model that they view the world, and they're like, we know for certain God is righteous.
Right.
And God blesses good people and God curses bad people. So what needs to happen now is Job needs to be made righteous so that he can be in good relationship with God again and be blessed again. So Job, what did you do that compromised your righteousness?
Yeah, what did you do that was bad? Like, why would this happen to you? You must have done something wrong. And if you think that this is somehow like an ancient idea that people don't have, we have this all the time. In fact, like, Jesus gets a question about this very specifically of like, a man was born crippled. Blind.
Yeah.
And the question that Jesus received was like, who sinned? Was it him, his parents, his mother, his dad? Like, what's the deal here, Jesus? Like, obviously, someone must have done something wrong. That's why this, malform happened. This thing that hurt this person, that happened. And Jesus had to respond to that. I still think about that here today, and I think in some of the ways that the church has responded to the homosexual population in like the 80s, right? There's kind of that rhetoric of like, homosexuals are bad, therefore God sent AIDS to them, and they deserve this punishment, and it is divine retribution for their sinful behavior. And I think you see in Job, and you see in Jesus' answer, that this is, we're going to clearly
unbiblical.
outline that that's not right.
Yeah, vile, unbiblical, yeah.
Yep.
But, so the friends, they get this bad rap because they're like, Job, what did you do wrong?
Yeah.
But we got to see in that divine counsel of God why this is happening.
Yeah.
Job's friends didn't. Job didn't.
Yeah.
And so they are trying to, based on their theological understanding,
Yep.
bring Job into right relationship to God so that he can be blessed.
Yep.
And so I really, and they go out of their way, they're there for a while. And so the issue with these friends is, in my view, not that they are bad friends. Mm-hmm. It's that they are operating with a broken mindset, which leads to bad and unfruitful efforts to help.
Yeah. It becomes bad counsel at a certain point, right? Like your friend is in pain and hurting because something bad happened in their life, and you're like, let's pick apart every decision you have, and we'll identify what sin caused this bad thing. Then you can repent from it, and the bad thing will move on.
Like, if your friend comes up to you and is like, oh, man, my dog got hit by a car, you're not going to be like, well, why'd you do that? It's like, what?
Yeah. Well, I mean, unless you hit the dog with a car.
And
even different comments. Yeah.
Even then, if it's not intentional, why'd you do that isn't helpful.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think it's important here to understand that can be kind of a takeaway here of like, when someone is going through a hard time, trying to find the meaning behind why the bad thing happened is not necessarily our number one priority, or maybe even on the spectrum of priorities. In a lot of cases, it's that first part, right, where the friends just for the first week hung out with him. Like, gave time out of their day to just be around, even when Job wasn't ready or willing to talk. But the kind of interesting part about Job, right, is it's not just these three friends. A new guy shows up, and he also has his own take on divine retribution.
So, about 30-ish chapters of Job are this cycle of the first three friends talking with Job, Job responds, talking with Job, Job responds. And they're trying to break apart, Job is saying, I'm righteous, and if, therefore, something is up with God. I want God to put me on trial because my righteousness will prove that whatever weird is happening on God's side.
Yeah.
It's not a direct accusation of God's unrighteousness, but it is a calling God into account because the fault isn't on Job's side. Yeah. And Job's friends are like, hey, the fault isn't on God's side, so what did you do?
Yep.
And so that's a solid 30 chapters. And then when his friends don't have a response, and Job is done trying to say the same, when they're done trying to say the same thing over and over to each other, then this young upstart comes in and says, whoa, first off, Job, what you're calling God's righteousness in this question, saying, hey, that you demanding God be held to your account, that is not a righteous position. Like, there's a problem there.
Yeah.
And he's not wrong about that.
Yes.
But then he also turns to his friends and he says, you calling Job into account and saying, you must have done something wrong, but we have no way to prove it, but you must have done something wrong, that's not a good account either. And so his statement is that divine retribution isn't always a reactive action. Okay. It's not always done after the fact.
Okay. Which means it could be done
before the fact.
Proactively. Which would be along the lines of like, if Marshall was going to run into the street, my son is 5, and I reached out and very roughly yanked him back, right, into safety. In that same sort of way, here's God's divine retribution happening before the real big event, letting you get kind of burned before you get all the way burned up, right?
Because Marshall could look at you with a sore arm and be like, "Dad, why did you hurt me?" That's not fair.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the case Elihu is making, this new friend of God is righteous, but he operates at a level that isn't always reactionary to what we do. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's, before so that we don't get hit by that car.
Yeah.
And it's a expansion of divine retribution that better accounts for the world, but it still falls so short because obviously there's the problem. The point the book is making is that this divine retribution is going to be where the problem ultimately lies.
Right. I mean, even as we look at it as Christians, like if divine retribution is like a thing, then as we live more moral lives, we should get more stuff and accrue more things. And, Christians and that we should be incredibly wealthy individuals because we're trying to do things right. But we understand that the reality is, though we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God and therefore deserve death, right? That the wages of sin are death. Jesus died to break that kind of an idea. And even within this, like Jesus doesn't even hold to the idea of divine retribution because he says, like, look, good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. This is the way things go.
Name someone better than Jesus, and then you look at should they get what Jesus got? Because that was rough. That was real rough.
Yes, that's a great kind of spot. So, Elihu is missing the point.
Yeah.
Because he's saying, hey, maybe it's not something you did. Maybe it's something you will do.
But God is still just in this divine retribution mindset.
Yes.
And so at this point, God comes in and he talks to Job.
Right. Job kind of gets his wish. Kind of.
In
a certain way, right?
Job wanted a trial so that he could prove he was righteous. And he, to the point where he said, if you listed out the accusations against me, I would wear them like a crown because it would only be a testament to my righteousness. Mm-hmm. But God doesn't give him a trial. Mm-hmm. God doesn't give Job an answer as to why he's suffering. What God does is he comes in and he says, who are you? Because I am God. Mm-hmm. Do you have any basis for understanding how the world works, how it's run? He takes Job through scenario after scenario, a lot of them involving animals, because men they're not righteous men, right? If God is still blessing them.
If God is, right, the idea is if God can bless, man, I don't know.
A stupid ostrich. That's an example.
A very dumb ostrich, the dumbest of ostriches, right? If he can bless that one, and he can curse, another animal, they're not capable of that rational thought. They're not capable of being righteous, and yet God still blesses them and does not bless other ones. And you were talking about, right, he's sending rain to deserts where nobody is. For what purpose? They didn't know then, and we still, we may have
it's not because
ideas.
God's blessing a dude.
Yeah.
And so that what the end of Job sort of breaks down is that God is saying, look, the world is not run on your system. The world is governed by my wisdom.
Yeah.
And what is your wisdom compared to mine? And it's nothing.
Yeah.
And so it really breaks this system of divine retribution of what I do, I get paid back for.
Right.
And it says there's not a formula you can follow. The world is governed by God's wisdom. Mm-hmm. And I really want to make sure to hit Job 4:6, which is one of his friends it's within one of his friends talks to him. But it says, is not your fear of God your competence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? Mm-hmm. Now, if divine retribution was true, I could be confident if I was righteous
Right.
in myself, in my own, because God is operating on this very simplistic formula. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people.
Yep.
But the Bible is so clear about our hope being in God, about our confidence being in God.
Yep.
And so our confidence cannot come from ourselves, because the world is not this simple formula of, if someone gets something good, it's because they deserved it. If someone gets something bad, it's because they deserved it. Rather, the entire world, in all of its complexity, way beyond what we understand, is governed by God's wisdom.
Right.
And so our hope, our confidence needs to be in God.
Right. And I think it is important, again, to note that the story of the Bible is kind of one that you see from start to finish, right? As we're talking about this, I'm thinking about Cain and Abel, right? Like kind of one of the very first, it's what, like Genesis 4, 5? It's one of those two, right? And you get Cain and Abel, and Abel has this like he gives this great sort of like, offering to God, and God is just, he loves it, right? And Cain just kind of gives like what he gathered from the field, like just kind of randomly, haphazardly, and God doesn't really like that. So you would think, right, Abel would end up being blessed and Cain would be cursed because of that. But what ends up happening is Cain kills Abel. The bad thing happens to the good one, not the good thing,
Yeah.
Technically, depending on how you look at it, right? Like it's clear that like the blessing didn't happen for Abel. It didn't protect his life. This bad thing happened to the quote unquote more righteous brother. And so we see that, and it just gets echoed. I mean, talk about Abraham and that dude, as much as we look at the faith that he had, it was counted as righteousness, not he was righteous. We hear that in the Hebrews.
Yep.
Right? And that sort of stuff. Like, you just get this long line of, like, King David, as good as he, quote unquote, was, he screwed up. Like, and good things and bad things happened to him at different periods of time in his life. And it's about our reaction to God. It's about our response to what Jesus did on the cross. Not about, well, I'm good, therefore only good things should happen to me. That's a bad sort of mentality to take. Or, you lost that thing that you held most dear. That must be your fault. And I would say I hear things that people say all the time still with that idea of divine retribution happening. Even though we have very clear examples in Job. We have very clear example in Jesus' response to who sinned in making this person blind. We have those very clear, like, I mean, the whole kind of death on a cross is so that bad people get the best thing. That people who don't measure up get the unequivocally the best thing that could ever happen. To be counted as a son or a daughter of God. To be welcomed into the family, adopted into something that you didn't deserve, that you couldn't earn, is a super interesting point. And so there is a ton of stuff in Job. And our like 35 minutes of what we did is really, quite honestly, probably does not do it enough justice. But if you're interested, one of the ideas that we were talking about with the kind of idea of this deep dive is that at the end, if you want to spend some time reading it yourself and really looking at it, that if you watch this deep dive, you have kind of this outline. And you can understand and have a deeper, fuller context of information as you make observations and then looking at the meaning within the book itself. So
it can be real confusing to read without this, because most of the book is Job's friends and him arguing back and forth about this divine retribution, which is ultimately the point is this doesn't work.
Yep.
But it sounds like, there can be a lot of confusion when reading it without a full perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so if you are encountering someone who's suffering, right, it's not about why. I mean, the first question they'll generally want answered is why.
Yes.
And that's not something we can answer.
Yeah.
Job himself never got told why. When God came down and said, the world is operated based on my wisdom, he didn't give Job answers to why any of this happened. Mm-hmm. We, the reader, had an idea, but Job never knew. And so the sitting with someone suffering and being like, they're asking why, you going, let me help you work out why, isn't always the most productive. It ultimately needs to be, our hope isn't in what our righteousness. Our hope is in God.
Yeah. So that's us. That's our Thursday deep dive. If you stuck it out to the very end, we're the most proud of you. And if you just watched some part of it and this is the end that you listened to, we're still proud of you. And so we hope you guys have a great time, and we'll see you on Sunday at City Park.